Hey everyone, and welcome to this session on the Forecasting and Policy Analysis System FPAS Mark II, developing human capital and how to use AI with that, especially in today's increasingly uncertain world for central banks all over the world. I'm your host, Joeri Schasfoort from Money and Macro, and in this session we're going into detail on how to run a central bank, specifically about how to organize a monetary policy department with these new technologies like AI. So luckily I have two amazing guests that can really help us get to the core of this issue. First we have Doug Laxton, a Canadian economist and founder of Central Point Research and the Better Policy Project. Before that he served as the head of economic modeling at the IMF, and prior to that he was at the Bank of Canada, where he played a key role developing the quarterly projection model to support early inflation targeting. He also published extensively on global economic modeling, climate change, oil prices, monetary policy, fiscal policy, macroprudential policy, essentially everything macroeconomics. And most recently, Doug has been instrumental in the development and implementation of this FPAS Mark II framework, helping central banks integrate it into their forecasting and policy analysis frameworks. Now, one of these central banks was the Central Bank of Armenia, from where we have our second guest, Armen Nurbekyan, Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Armenia since December 2022. He there oversees monetary policy, research, and statistics, and his tenure at the Central Bank of Armenia, CBA, includes roles in the monetary policy, financial stability, and research departments, so also basically everything macroeconomics. He also worked at the economic modeling division of the IMF's research department, and he's played a critical role in the development and implementation of FPAS Mark II at the Central Bank of Armenia, driving its integration into the policy-making process. So, the perfect two guests to talk about how to essentially run a monetary policy department using this framework and train the people, now increasingly using AI, so training young central bankers. So, to kick this off, Armen, I was wondering, can you take us back to when you were trained, where you essentially made the transition from training as an economist, school, to professional economist in the era? This was, I think, all before AI.
Hello, Yuri. Thanks very much for a very kind introduction. This is a very interesting topic, and I'm actually to answer your question directly. I'm actually a mathematician by training, and then I basically came to the central bank and worked in several different positions. And I think the most important thing in all of these positions that I had in my trainings is basically to ask the right questions, and then to be able to really dig whatever tools you have, learn and try to answer the questions. Think like an economist. I think this is the most important thing, and this is where human capital in the central banks is really important, because for this you really need to have good mentors. There are things which are not written in any books, that you really need good mentors to make sure that they maintain the balance of challenging you in terms of asking the right questions, but at the same time, helping you a bit to navigate through this, difficult discipline. So I think this is basically the, before AI, we'll go into this more, in next half an hour or so. But I think there are actually many, analogies between the tools that we had before AI,
Mm-hmm.
even though we didn't have the AIs, of course, but we had sophisticated tools. And I think there are very similar questions that we were asking at that times. I think lots of central banks made very similar mistakes, even with the tools that we had before. So I think, in a sense, that's the big question, right? Because AI has so many similarities in terms of its productivity growth with the previous, technological innovations. At the same time, it has something which is really new. And so I hope we will get into this. But I think the bottom line is, in my training at the central bank and also at the research department where Doug was my boss, I think this was the key thing. Can you think? Can you answer the questions? Can you really think out of box and really dig. This was the main, I think, thing that we valued and tried to, organize the institution and human capital in a way that this basically trickles down from the experienced economist to basically new economists who joined the bank.
Yeah. Hey, and you mentioned these technological revolutions in the past that have similarities to AI. Just for people who maybe not know about them, can you name some examples?
Yeah, I think it's the reason the example that I like to think of is basically, well, I haven't worked with punch cards. Doug for sure has worked with punch cards, but basically,
Thanks, Armen.
even though he looks very
For
young,
sure.
no. But the point is that in terms of abstract models and mathematical apparatus, there were lots of innovations throughout. But if you look at what was the main bottleneck, let's say 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, right? There was a time that people were working with the punch cards, which means, for if you wanted to run a simulation, you need to have a very big room with a very big computer, waste a lot of time in terms of putting the right things on the punch card, and then wait a lot for the answer. And if you actually miscalculated something or did something wrong, you had to go through the whole process. Now, so this was the technology, let's say 50 years ago. Now, if you basically fast forward to the 2000s, now you can have whatever simulation you want with different types of programming languages, be it MATLAB, R, whatever, right? And you can do infinitely more complex exercises. So in essence, it's basically just technologically, it's a very big productivity growth,
Yeah.
right? So the question is, the distance between punch cards and very complicated models in terms of the technology, what did that change taught us? Basically, what did that teach us, right? As economists, as central banks, and then the next question is, how different is gonna be basically from that point of having these models and econometric models, structural models, whatever, and the toolkit and AI. So I think these are the kind of. So what are the similarities and what are the differences? So I think this is the sort of the main question that I have in my mind, and I have some observations about it.
Interesting. Before getting into those, Doug, do you want to already chime in on your experience with punch cards or anything else?
Yeah. Back when we had punch cards, we would have to be a lot more careful, and we would have to think a lot more, as opposed to just trying to let the computer do the thinking for us. So I like very much what Armen said, but once you kind of recognize that, then you recognize that it's a management problem, that you have to still find people that that have curiosity and that want to dig deep. And here, I would actually draw from one of our senior advisors. His name is Bob Ford. So all of our senior advisors are ex-IMF guys that we've kind of handpicked. So great researchers, and in Bob's case, he was a legend at the IMF and the OECD, managing flagship products like the wheel and stuff like this. And one of my brilliant students, and this is partly AI, learned English and economic terminology at an absolutely rapid pace. And once they do this, then we give them access to Bob, and so I was listening to her ask Bob a question, which is, what makes a great economist, Bob? And Bob actually said something very similar to what Armen just said. It's the ability to ask questions and to dig deep and not get lost. The difference between a really good economist and one that's not so good is that they, not only are curious and can dig deep, but but they don't get lost. The difference is that we have too many economists now that can't dig very deep before they get lost in the details of what they're doing and forgetting about why we're doing what we're doing. So I like very much Armen's point, but the implication of that is that this all comes down to management. Like, management has to set standards for what an economist is, and of course, if those standards are not, being satisfied from economists that graduate from grad school or an undergrad or graduate program or whatever, then there has to be some sort of training program or rigorous processes students go through to learn. So I like very much. Now, what I'm experiencing now is that people over time seem to get frustrated faster. So, for example, the guys that deal with punch cards and mainframe computer technology, we had to be pretty damn patient. We couldn't make a lot of mistakes because nothing would work, and so our whole goal was to make sure that we could eliminate mistakes that were potentially avoidable, and so on. So that's what our whole focus is. As people, I think, get wealthier, as we get used to using machines, you might say that people are kind of losing their patience to go deep. And so what has happened with AI and large language models, I'm seeing it with my students that they're they're becoming much less frustrated. Ones that simply wouldn't be in the game because they don't have the, that sort of, I would say, perseverance to work through difficult, tedious problems, coding and so on, that those things are no longer a constraint for them. They're, because they don't get frustrated, they don't get confused because the ChatGPT or some other AI tool is helping them to jump over those little things. So yeah, I see incredible potential. On the weekend, as Trump said in the famous Zelensky meeting, that this makes great TV. When I've been watching the news recently, one of the biggest things that happened on the weekend, but I'm sure that many people didn't recognize this, was a commitment by the Chinese government to integrate AI into the school system. This to me is like something that is like, that should be incredibly newsworthy. I was talking to a student, PhD student, about to graduate from an Ivy League school in math this morning, and she said that half of her professors are totally against AI, and the other half are totally for it. So that there's not only polarity between the Democrats and the Republicans, but there's polarity in terms of whether or not AI is even a good thing to incorporate into the educational system. And again, my basic message to that would be, it's all about how we manage it. That, we have to understand what the risks are, but we also have to realize what the opportunities are, for learning. And in China, I worked with a lot of very smart Chinese people, like people that, would be in the top 1% club. And if you could have access to that kind of brain power, if you could democratize education, it could be staggering. And this old idea that we used to have that China never fit growth models. They have already shown it with the electrification of electric buses and producing a cheap EV, $11,000 for an EV. The fact that they can just decide that they're going to incorporate AI into their educational system like that is staggering. Like they will have an incredible lead on many economies that are struggling through these kinds of issues and so on. But there's many issues that deal with AI and central banks, and it'd be fun to get Armen's perspective on those kinds of issues. When I started using it as a researcher, I don't think Armen has actually, but when I started using it as a researcher, it has become just mind-boggling because even older people like myself can be very, very productive. Like, I've trained ChatGPT so that it gives me better answers, like based on my training. Without training, the answers would be complete. I would not like the answers. I use ChatGPT as an indication of ignorance, of the reason why we need economic and financial literacy. But now that I've trained ChatGPT, now that I know how to train ChatGPT, it's increased my productivity massively as an economist. And it raises a very
when you say training,
question.
Doug, what do you mean? Like prompt it? Prompt it with the right prompt? Is that training? Yeah.
No. So training means that you can supply it with a bunch of information. And so in my case, for example, if I'm writing a paper, I can supply it with information from a bunch of other papers, maybe previous papers that I've written. And what's amusing there is that how dissatisfied I am with my previous papers, because just its ability to be able to write more clearly, okay? Its ability to do things like, when you're thinking about, this is something that's really important for you, Joeri, because you're into communications. Anytime you're trying to write a paper, you're trying to think of the audience, okay? And the problem is, sometimes you have different audiences in mind, and that creates an incredible conflict for when you're trying to write a paper. But with ChatGPT, you can say, look, I want a version of the document for this audience, for a general audience with no jargon, whatever. I want a version of that is for a technical audience. And with those instructions, as well as all the training material that you've given it that expresses your ideas, you have to do virtually no typing. Its ability to understand verbal instructions, even when they're complete gibberish in some cases, given all of that previous training, okay, that you've done, to tell it what it is you're trying to do, is incredible. Like, so the productivity of doing research is, has gone way up for senior researchers. I think also the productivity for training has gone up. So when you think of training as, as Armen was saying, that you have mentors, we will be able to, I think, the head of LinkedIn has created a clone. I don't know if you've seen this yet, but they actually have a physical clone that that tries to respond in a way that like he would respond. And it's amazing how good that is. So effectively, that's what ChatGPT is doing for me. ChatGPT is predicting what I'm likely to be trying to say on the basis of all of the training that I've given it. So, for example, we're also involved in developing AI. Okay, and the development of AI, you can think of what we're doing right now as prototyping it. by basically just doing it in a thing where we say we just load this amount of information into ChatGPT, or we use the amount of information that you're allowed in ChatGPT to train it. Okay, so ChatGPT allows you to put a bunch of information in there about who you are and what you like, what your preferences are, but then you can simply just add, papers and say, this is, and you can use a combination of AI tools to do this. For example, you could use some AI tools that are really, really good at taking a body of knowledge and breaking it down. And so you could do that before you go to ChatGPT. So this is what I'm talking about training. But the AI that we're actually developing, okay, at AIpoweredlearning.org is going to do that more systematically, and it will be optimized to effectively simulate the kinds of things that we're actually doing manually with a combination of AI tools and so on.
Very
Maybe
interesting. Also interesting that you, as a seasoned professional, have seen your productivity go up with AI. Armen, can you tell us maybe also a little bit about how in the central bank you're using this to train other people?
Discuss a bit what Doug was saying, and then continue it, because I think there are very important points that we need to talk about here.
Yeah.
I think the point about training at the central banks and in general, and how we would use AI, and how would that be useful for policy at the end of the day, is a very interesting one, right? Because so there are two forces that I'm going to try to balance. There is a bit of a sort of the old school technology, shouldn't say pessimistic, but technology agnostic way of thinking. And there is a bit of a very innovative, embracing all the innovation type of thinking. So I'm going to basically tell a bit of a stories on both sides, and then let's try to integrate those, right? Now, from the very sort of pessimistic or technology agnostic point of view, in terms of the policy, I think there's a very stark observation that we can make. Despite all of this very big technological advancement that we have talked about, starting from punch cards coming to AI, if you look at the monetary policy issues that the world today is facing, if you look at the lessons learned that from the COVID, you would be amazed how similar are those to what we had basically 20, 30 years ago. The point about, for example, that the credibility of the central banks matter. If you are a big central bank or small central bank, everybody is now suddenly talking about non-linearities or credibility, that you can actually have an inflationary problem in the US, Europe, and advanced countries. These are not new points. Doug has been writing about credibility 20 years ago, I think. So it is basically very striking how similar are the policy conclusions or the lessons learned, despite the technological advancement. Okay, so if you talk to people like Bob Ford or Doug, right, they would tell you that, yeah, of course, this was the policy that we were doing a long time ago, and the models are now much more complicated. They of course give you much more color in terms of trying to put these narratives into the lines, but the bottom line is, there is not much new things going on. So I think that's sort of that's an important point, because there are things that are important for economists, which are not depending on technology so much. At some point we shouldn't put so much attention to technology. So that's point number one. Now, in terms of the standards at the central banks in general, and how do we basically balance the AI versus sort of, again, the old school? That's also a very interesting question, right? Now, from my experience in central bank at the fund, when I was consulting some other central banks as well, it would be amazing to see what is the most most popular reason, Joeri, that people are wasting time at the central banks at the meetings, like economists. Do you have a guess?
So I would think meetings. That's what they're wasting time with, like
That's
talking to.
true, but why? Because there are good meetings and there are bad meetings. So what do you think is the most popular reason, which is connected to the training of the people?
So then, that they're bad meetings.
Yeah.
Or do you want me to get into more detail then? Why
No,
they're bad
what I'm
meetings?
gonna say is that what I want to say is that usually the reason that the meetings are bad and the most time that is wasted, because I cannot tell how many meetings I have been to, that people are wasting their time and discussing things, looking at the graphs, charts, or tables, which nobody had an idea what are the units, what is the underlying data, like really simple stuff. I have been in meetings that really important people were making really important conclusions, talking about really important stuff for a long time, and then finding out that the things that they were looking at, are not the things that they're actually thinking they're looking at. And believe me, this is a very common problem. And this is important because when Doug is talking about standards, it's easier said than done. It means that the person who was preparing, young economist who is preparing this chart, this graph, has to understand how important it is to make sure that he knows the data, he knows the underlying statistics, he can put it in a way that everybody can understand. So this real simple stuff is always underestimated, is an essential part for an economist in terms of their training. AI, believe me, cannot help you. This is where AI can actually make it worse, because if you don't know that simple standard stuff, and you can basically, somebody gives you a magic stick like AI, you may think that you understand a lot, but in fact you cannot even, put together a good graph.
Yeah.
This is a really important part. I have to say, when I was younger, people who were basically mentoring me were pushing me on this. I was thinking, this is, why are these grumpy people, putting so much, pressure on this kind of stuff. But now I understand because I have to do the same thing with young stuff. So this is a very important point in my mind because these standards are very important. They are very important to make sure that people understand what they are doing, and then integrating AI on top of this is something that we should think about. Now, I think if you look at we were talking about the responsible AI in our conference, I think a couple of months ago. And I think in this context, it's also important to mention why we are talking about the word responsible AI, right? And the reason that we are talking about the responsible AI because AI, we have to separate here, like the general conversations about AI, that you can basically open up any conference and somebody will tell you that these AI models, the large language models, they have no future. They are basically just computing power. And at the same time, you will have some people saying, no, this is very close to a AGI, artificial general intelligence, right? So I don't want to get into this, right? So we have to separate. And given that question, that there are so many scenarios. There is a scenario that AI is going to be incredibly powerful and going to AGI very soon. There is a scenario that no, this may be actually leveling out. But the point is that we need to talk about responsible AI because AI is something which can do lots of good, and at the same time it can do lots of bad. When you have something which can do at the same time lots of good and lots of bad, then you need to be responsible about it. Now, to put it in the context of our conversation, what do we mean by responsible AI when we talk about training staff or kids? This is really important. Now, so what is the responsible thing to do, right? So in my mind, the responsible thing to do is to make sure that we don't spoil them and make sure they know how to think, okay? And we basically make sure that they can use AI as a complementary tool for what they are doing. And this is very easy to actually basically misuse if you don't have this question in mind. And here I think that Doug was talking about China integrating AI into the schools. Let me tell you a couple of examples where I think it's you have to do it in the right way, in my opinion. And so let me go to philosophy a bit. The word pedagogy, right? if you talk about pedagogues, right? If you basically translate it from Greek, it basically has two roots. Number one is child, which is the first part, peda, right? And then you have the second part, and if you translate it from Greek, it means leadership. So Greeks, as we know, they were, they were really forward-looking in many sense. They are basically the where the Western civilization and philosophy is stemming from. So they recognized very early on that pedagogy is not about just training people in just mechanical way. It's really about leading children through uncertain times. Now, if you put it in that context, it's much bigger question: how can AI lead children to understand the world, right? And so this is where the responsibility is really important, because if you don't do it in the right way, you can literally lose generations. Because your generations can literally, and we know that they're very early on, it's very important that they actually learn how to, ask questions, be curious, and all that kind of stuff. So I think this is really, really important to put in that context, and to be very careful. Actually, there are a couple of observations in that sense that I want to make. For example, I think in Scandinavia, I think in Denmark, at some point, even not talking about AI, they moved lots of things to digital in the schools.
Yeah.
And so what they learned is that in this basically kids learning results actually suffered a lot from digital, because somehow when you actually read the real book, you think harder and you can understand better. So they actually rolled back from digital to real books. So that's number one.
Yeah, that's
In
what Doug
Armenia,
mentioned as well. Yeah.
In Armenia, in one of the schools that I was basically talking to, they basically told me that given this technology world, how frequent it is to find that kids, they don't know how to read, and not literally how to read. They can read stuff, but they just go through it. They don't read it like read it. So you have to actually teach them how to read. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this in this context is that yes, it's very important. AI is incredibly useful tool in hands of people who know what they're doing. But at the same time, if you don't use it in the right way, it's actually very, very risky. Now, technology, sort of basically innovation embracing part of it. Now, if you are actually in the central bank, that what are you doing, you have people who know how to ask the real questions. In that sense, actually, and you give AI, it's actually incredibly productivity enhancing tool. Incredibly. You can make very nice reports. You can make very nice presentations, in a very efficient manner. And and I think this is something absolutely that all the central banks should strive to do. And I think so. The key in terms of going forward is to find this balance where you can use the AI in this productivity enhancing way without basically spoiling your economists from the outset, giving them tools that they cannot use. And this is also something that, for example, in the modeling division that we have been working with Doug, this was also sort of the philosophy that make sure you give the tools to people who know actually what they're doing. And so I think this is the real question to go forward. So I think at the central bank and together with Doug, this is what we are trying to do. First, we torture economists, young economists, with basically basic stuff that they think is stupid, but it's absolutely worth doing it, which is learn the units, understand what are the measurement statistics, what are you looking at, make sure it's professional, and then after that trying to replicate or basically enhance their performance with AI. So I think this is the way to go. Otherwise, I think there is a very high probability of really losing generations. I had a calculus professor in university. He was a really scary guy, and he used to say that to students, he used to say that your problem is not that you don't understand. Your problem is that you don't understand that you don't understand. So this is the risk, right? Because if you give a powerful tool and everybody can basically produce whatever nice charts and reports, they may think they actually understand, but in fact they don't understand. So I think this is the sort of the balancing act, this is the path that we, the central bank, want to follow.
Yeah. Okay.
But
That
we-
sounds really logical to me. That you want to start with without a tool, so that they understand the basics, so that they become advanced, and then give the newly advanced users the tools to make them, super productive. As
Yeah,
Doug
actually-
is also using these tools now as an already advanced user, right? Yeah. Go for it, Doug.
So actually, we came up with a law. It's called Don Cohn's law. Don Cohn is a very famous figure at the Federal Reserve Board, who was one of the lieutenants, the main lieutenant for like maybe a couple decades. He ran the domestic part of the Fed, and he disallowed economists using models to create their baseline forecast. Okay, and guys like me that created models, to help us impose macro consistency and forecast, having practiced what I've done and looked at the results, I would say he was right. And you cannot give models to young economists. You need to take models away from young economists and see if they can think without them. What he was afraid of was that models would mean that the Fed would lose all the color, all the analysis that goes into constructing like a macroeconomic forecast, but they have to do that judgmentally now. That takes an enormous amount of resources that can be solved quite easily by using their FPAS model. But again, it might mean that you won't have a training ground where people have to learn how to think and do analysis by themselves. So I like very much what Armen said, and I would also admit that I might be partly responsible for creating this generation of extremely poorly trained economists that somehow think that the model is going to tell them what the answer was. Okay, I mean that to some extent was the problem during COVID, like during the 2021, during those early phases, people were putting way too much emphasis on a bunch of bogus models that effectively ignored all the insights from history about thinking about the underlying causes of inflation. Like Mervyn King has a very valid point there that we talk about in this Oxford economic paper on the future of macroeconomics that David Vines has been editing over the last few years and so on. I would agree 100% with what Armen was talking about. We call it a dynamic learning environment. And so I have this kind of database of all these successful people in my life. You're there, Armen. Don't be afraid. And they've all experienced a dynamic learning environment. If you ask them, when was the very first time that you ever experienced a dynamic learning environment, they've always experienced it at some point in the past, and out of that experience, they've learned to look for other dynamic learning environments. So I'll give you my example because I think it's a really good one. My first one that I can remember was a volleyball team. And I was in a small town, less than 1,000 people, so we had a very, very small population. But we had this professional hockey player that basically came to the end of his career. His name was Bill Payne, by the way. And he came to be the physical education teacher of our school. So we created a volleyball team. Now the reason I love this analogy is that, in going back to Armen's point about the meaning of pedagogy and the roots of it, is that what he taught us was a few of the fundamentals about how to set the ball, how to spike the ball, a few basic plays. But once we were out there in that court, it was the six of us that were learning about what each other person could do in terms of their strengths and their weaknesses. And that leadership of teaching us how to do that propelled us to play on a level that was much, much higher than what you would expect from a town with a population of 1,000. In other words, we were kicking butt of cities and so on. And I think that is kind of like a superb analogy of what a dynamic learning environment should be about, where the teacher's role is to provide some basic training and so on, but then he allows the students then to take over and to learn by themselves how to do things. So it's impossible for a single individual to capture and explain to the team. The other great thing about the volleyball example is that everybody has to play a rotating position. In other words, sometimes you have to be the server. Sometimes you have to be in the back row and learn how to make basic defensive moves to get it to a setter to set to one of your spikers. So that's another example that we integrate into our training, because what we found is that economists have become way too specialized. And they're, in big central banks, there are the incredible communication challenges from getting all these specialists to communicate with each other. And in some cases, I would say most cases, Bob Ford is right, that they've gone deeper, but in many cases they've just gotten lost. The quality of the work is just gone. It's become little cliques in the profession, where you have people getting together and say, this is really, really good and so on, but it's really of questionable value. Most of this research, it seems more like they're getting lost.
I think that's a great quote to end the session on, Doug. It was super insightful for me, in the sense that I think it really brought into perspective that AI, even though it's a very new technology and is incomparable to, for example, modeling advances in the past, the effect on training economists has lots of parallels, and it's really dangerous in the sense that it can prevent economists from learning the fundamentals, right? And then rely on this ultra powerful tool instead. And so what you're proposing is, at least what I heard, is like to train economists in the central bank environment. The best way to do it is to force them to start at the basics and then gradually introduce these tools as they advance. So thank you so much for that. We have unfortunately come at the end of our session, and I'm sure we'll have many follow-ups. But I think that's a really key insight to end the session on. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thanks very much.
Joeri. Thanks, Armen.